So, picking back up on the second half of our section on affect and emotions, some quick updates and reminders. Quiz 4 is due this Friday at 11:59 p.m. Make sure to complete the assigned reading for this week. I have read it before, I've assigned it before, and I decided to go ahead and reread it again this weekend. I really enjoyed it. It's engaging. I think it's a really interesting um, reading, and I think it will go smoothly for you all. I think you'll enjoy it, and I think it ties together things that we've discussed in previous weeks with what we're discussing in this section on affect and emotion. Your activity 3 will be graded by this evening, hopefully. If not by tomorrow, for sure. It's there's quite a few questions on this one. Many of you have gone very in depth, which is excellent. And it's just taking a little bit longer than anticipated to grade them, but they will be graded as soon as possible. And make sure to watch the supplementary videos for this week. I think they add a lot of depth and dimension to our conversations on affect and emotion. They're not directly tied in to what we're discussing in class, but I do think that they are very good supplements to these conversations and will kind of expand um, some of your thoughts on these various concepts that we discuss as we move through the rest of the section. So, there are generally two approaches to really most of the things that we cover in social psychology. But when we look at affect and emotion, there are generally two approaches, and that is the interactionist approach and the structuralist approach. The interactionist approach views emotions as primarily dependent on definitions of the situation, emotion vocabularies, as well as emotion beliefs, whereas the structuralist approach views emotions as invariant, automatic, patterned responses to particular classes of social stimuli. And so, essentially, what's important to note here is that the interactionist approach really takes into consideration the context in which you're operating, whereas the structuralist approach sees things or emotions as more so like these pattern responses to particular types, particular classes of stimuli. So it's not necessarily, it's kind of removing that from the bonds of context, which actually the picture I chose for this, it's an art um, installation in this building in Venice, Italy. I just kind of stumbled upon it and thought it was really interesting. And so the picture on the right, the structuralist approach is, it's a real picture, but I thought it did a really good job of kind of illustrating um, like these pillars, for example, but you completely remove them from context. You're not necessarily looking at the context of the situation, just like the structure itself. Um, and so, yeah, I thought it was a good visual reminder of kind of these differences between an interactionist and a structuralist approach. So keep that in mind as we, not just in terms of the things that we've already discussed in this section, but for the rest of this discussion, as well as our discussion Wednesday, and thinking about, is this coming from a more interactionist approach or is this coming from a more structuralist approach? So, emotions are a major part of our social lives. And again, they profoundly shape our relationships and social interactions. And so, typically, when we think of emotion, we think of it simply on the individual level. Um, but, especially when we think about like the psychological focus, or in the field of psychology, a focus on emotions, it's most definitely on the individual level. Um, but as social psychology has developed, there's more of a focus on emotions and relationships specifically and how they go to influence group level social phenomena. And actually, that's something we're going to cover a bit Wednesday in terms of like the critiques of um, sociological psychology's interest in affect and emotions, is that it really has a difficult time explaining macro level phenomena and then connecting macro level phenomena to micro level and group processes. So there's a few different areas of focus in terms of interest, but also each of these is not just an area of interest, but also an area for critique. And so, in terms of the distributions of emotional experience, while we hold many beliefs about the distribution of emotional experiences across society, those assumptions have not been systematically tested. So, for example, in terms of gender socialization, due to differential socialization by gender, women are thought to be more empathetic, more loving, and less able to feel or express anger, while men are believed to feel or express fear and sadness less frequently compared to women. And negative feelings are more often directed down the status hierarchy towards less powerful individuals, while positive feelings are often directed upward toward more powerful individuals. And thus, higher status individuals should be more happy or should be happier and more satisfied. And so, thinking about the distributions of emotional experiences, we can make certain assumptions, maybe based on, like I said, differential gender socialization being one. We can make these assumptions, but they haven't been systematically tested. And so, when we say distributions of emotional experience, you can kind of think about that as like the epidemiology of emotion. The second point are beliefs about emotions. Subjective experiences are influenced not only by society's emotion vocabulary, or the words we use to describe emotions, whether that be feelings or in their expression. And these include rules about what one should and should not feel or express. These emotion cultures produce the concepts of feeling rules and display rules. And these are normative expectations. And so, feeling rules or emotion norms refer to beliefs about the appropriate range, intensity, duration, and targets of private feelings in given situations. Display rules, on the other hand, or expression norms, similarly regulate the range, intensity, duration, and targets of emotional behaviors. So, for example, one example here is a study that examines sympathy norms and the rules of sympathy exchange. People generally believe that they have a right to sympathy during times of difficulty, and that recipients of sympathy should be grateful and should reciprocate at some later time. And norm violations of this expectation often result in resentment, avoidance, and social condemnation. This is difficult to study though because of the taken for granted nature of these feelings and display rules, and also because researchers who are observing individuals live in their own emotion cultures or a constellation of beliefs about feelings. But it's important to note that emotion cultures also must be learned, and how emotional knowledge is acquired and subjective experiences are shaped. Um, is the next issue. And so we get to emotional socialization. And so developmental psychologists have a history of studying things like role modeling, imitation, and instruction in shaping children's emotional responses. They typically document the ages at which children have acquired certain effective knowledge and skills. They mainly examine sex and age related variations in socialization practices and children's knowledge. Sociological social psychologists, however, tend to focus on those factors that are often overlooked, like ethnicity, social class, and the structural and contextual variations in emotional socialization. So, for example, societies tend to structure children's environments so that The experiences of some emotions are more likely than others. The more society's institutions are age graded, the less children's knowledge of emotion should correspond to adults. So, what that means is like when we say like age graded, so when kids go to school every day, they're typically put into groups and isolated from other children. And of course, that can be like isolated, like there's multiple teachers for one grade, but typically they still get to interact with those children, like maybe on the playground, but it's always age graded by, like, let's say you have a class of 6 and 7 year olds and 7 and 8 year olds and 8 and 9 year olds. So that's what we mean when we say like structured in a particular way, and age graded. So they're grouped in terms of like cohorts of specific age groups. So, one example in particular, one researcher argued that the requirements and rewards of service sector jobs um, produce workers who are skilled in what's called emotional labor. And this affects parents' emotional socialization practices. And what some of these studies have found are that middle class children should be more skilled than lower class children at this type of feeling work. And so I want you to think back to the article we read earlier in the semester, Coach for the Classroom, and how we saw how children were coached to interact with their teachers to ask for help, and how that resulted in these class based differences in the classroom and class based outcomes in terms of like academic performance and their experience um, within school and with their teachers. And so we can think about this in a very similar way in terms of like emotional socialization. Um, and that's something that will connect to one of the things we're going to discuss Wednesday, and how these, which connects to more macro level things like the work environment and certain values in the workplace, and how that influences parents' um, values in their way of operating in the world, and then how they transmit that information to their children. But here, I want you to specifically think about it in a very similar way as the article Coach for the Classroom, and how emotional socialization can result in certain like class-based differences um, and experiences of emotion. And so then we have types of role taking, and how this too is something that's a part of emotion socialization. So not just trained on how on what types of emotions are appropriate, how they should be expressed, and in what situations, but also the way in which you think of yourself in terms of or in relation to others. So taking into consideration, um, like, are you focused more on your own behavior or the behavior of someone else? So, for example, with reflexive role taking, um, emotions result from imagining how others would react to an individual's thoughts or behaviors, whereas empathetic role taking, emotions result from mentally placing oneself in another's position and feeling what they might feel in that situation. And so, one thing I want you to think about in this section, so today, but also Wednesday, is what types of behavior might this elicit from the person who is engaging in role taking, but also from others with whom that person is interacting. And where the focus is the focus on the self, or is the focus on the other? So, with reflexive role taking, they're imagining how others would react to them. So the focus is more on the self. Whereas empathetic role taking, the focus is on how that other person might feel in response to them. But at the same time, both types of role taking can elicit like altruistic behavior. Um, they just have different motivations. So with like reflexive role taking, you might feel shame, imagining how others might react to your thoughts or behaviors. You might feel shame, and then behave altruistically in order to restore pride or that sense of self. But with empathetic role taking, you might behave altruistically in order to reduce that like vicarious distress. And so consider not only what types of behavior these could elicit, but also where the focus is. Is it on the self? Is it on others? And also, what in an environment or in an interaction um, uh, can trigger this role taking or engaging in role taking, and what kind? Do situations cue you to engage in reflexive role taking, whereas other situations cue you to engage in empathetic role taking, and so on and so forth. And how does this relate to things like group norms and that normative behavior, as well as things like group prototypes, in group prototypes, and out group stereotypes? And then we have emotional labor. So each setting, each definition of the situation will require different kinds of emotional responses and thus feeling management. Emotional labor is the way in which workers present and manage their emotions slash behavior due to their role. We train ourselves to act in certain ways underpinned by a set of rules about emotion. And so, what's important to note here is that emotional labor is not just the way we manage our emotions and the way that they're presented to others. So, like impression management, and this is certainly kind of like a dimension of that. It's not just the way we manage our emotions internally or externally. It's both. So it's the way we present and manage our emotions slash behavior, and that's due to these role expectations, which we discussed last week in terms of like characteristic emotions and emotion norms that are associated with particular roles and identities. And most of the time, emotional labor is something that focuses, or the focus is on occupation and within the workplace. But in a very practical sense, it's not just limited um, to the workplace or to like workplace and occupational roles. And you can connect that back when thinking about characteristic emotions and emotion norms. You can connect that back to things like that we discussed in identity theory and social identity theory. So, like in group prototypes, for example, and those norms and expectations of group behavior. And this is that emotional dimension. How are you expected to act and to feel and to express your emotions within any given situation? And this occurs because we are subject to feeling rules dictating what our role identity ought to feel in a situation. And this occurs because there's this conflict between your internal feelings and those role expectations, and requires effort, planning, and control. So, one example of emotional labor is, if you're working with like clients or customers and they're being rude to you, for whatever reason, and you really you're experiencing negative emotions, but because of your position, because of your role, you have to maintain a calm demeanor. You have to appear as though you're being polite and calm and that you're genuinely listening to their concerns. And you can't necessarily express how you actually feel to a customer or client, but you also have to maintain those perceptions um, with your coworkers as well as your boss. And of course, there's um, a variety of settings in the workplace where you might be able to express these emotions more openly. But certainly, working one on one with clients or customers, you have to maintain a particular front and maintain a particular impression that corresponds to those role expectations and those characteristic emotions. And emotional labor is higher when the job requires things like frequent contact and duration, a long duration and display of emotions, where you have to display a variety of emotions and display more intense emotions. And so, in terms of emotional labor, um, there's typically three, or rather, there's three main reasons Why we engage in emotional labor. The first is to mitigate negative emotions. So, one study found that victims of intimate partner violence often use prayer as a strategy, a way to manage their fear and anger and sadness caused by their experiences. So, to mitigate negative emotions across a variety of situations. And we also engage in emotional labor because of these situational feeling rules. So, to avoid being seen as emotionally deviant, we will perform certain emotional expressions according to the feeling rules and cultural norms for a given situation. So, for example, we can think about experiences of grief, let's say at a funeral. And of course, there are certain cultural norms and expectations. um, One example might be like by gender. Um, you're expected uh, you're expected to express and emotions perhaps in a different way according to gender. Um, but also you don't want to be seen as emotionally deviant. So maybe perhaps you experience and express grief. To you, that's something that's very private, it's very intimate, it's not something you really want to share with others. But because you don't want to be seen as emotionally deviant, like if you're not, um, displaying that grief to some extent, people, I don't know, might see that as concerning or strange. So you, to a certain extent, um, might feel the need to perform those emotional expressions um, so that you can meet those feeling rules and those cultural norms. On the flip side, you might also suppress some of those emotions um, and engage in that kind of um, performance to meet those same feeling rules and cultural norms. And finally, we engage in emotional labor um, to manage our own emotions first and foremost, but oftentimes it's also to manage the emotions of others. So, one example are like bill collectors engaging in emotional labor when they act angry to induce fear in debtors in the hopes that that fear will motivate them to pay their debts. And of course, this is just kind of a one very specific example, but just more generally, you can think about if you're working with people, like say you're working in education or you're working in mental health. Um, it can be really important that you're not just managing your own emotions in a particular situation, but you're being mindful of others and their responses to you. So again, going back to that reflexive and empathetic role taking, and trying to manage their emotions in that situation as well. But other than that, that's it for today. Your quiz 4 is due Friday. Um, but other than that, I hope you have a great day. And that's it. Thanks.